This series is dedicated to Brother Steve Coakley.
So the book one says that there's a relationship between the Boule and Skull and Bones. Let's get to another part of what it says. It also says that it's an interesting phenomenon about the Boule. It says, the Boule started in 1904. The NAACP and the Urban League started only years later. The other black male fraternities and black female sororities actually were founded with the sanction of the beast to counteract the grassroots movement of Marcus Garvey. That's right. That's right.
The early 1900s, the stage for some of the most influential political movements of American blacks unto this day. The philosophies, however, were in constant conflict of interest, either naturally or by design. Created in 1909, the NAACP fostered the most notoriety and recognition from the ruling class, but other movements such as Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Machine had also inspired so-called blacks abroad. One of these so-called inspired blacks was Marcus Garvey. In this episode, we will highlight the life and times of Marcus Garvey. When we left off last episode, Marcus had migrated to England, anxiously anticipating a new adventure upon the hallowed streets of London. A great opportunity, as Marcus saw, to formalize his position in society through acquiring worldly education and experience. Fellow Jamaicans like Claude McKay, who was from a well-to-do Jamaican family of Ashanti descent, was a fanatic of all things British, wrote glowingly of Jamaica's colonial savior. Rhetoric of the like energized the imaginations of Marcus. Upon arriving in London, finding steady income was elusive for Garvey, rendering him to swallow his pride and ask for public assistance. Eventually, Marcus did find work on the docks in London. While working at the docks, Garvey met several West Indian men with dreams of similar exploits, who had all but rolled snake eyes on their prospects for good fortune, and were now prospecting the next ship for a prodigal return home. According to Garvey historian Colin Grant, during this time at the dockyard, a brother seaman plugged Garvey into the new black drop in London, the African Times and Orient Review. A new publication inaugurated in July 1912, Dusè Muhammad Ali coined as a monthly devoted to the interests of the colored races of the world. Quote, the recent Universal Races Congress convened in the metropolis of the Anglo-Saxon world clearly demonstrated that there was ample need for a pan-Oriental and pan-African journal at the seat of the British Empire, which would lay the aims, desires, and intentions of the black, brown, and yellow races within and without the empire at the throne of Caesar. End quote. The experiences of Marcus Garvey are filled with a plethora of bizarre and noteworthy characters who at some point play reoccurring and contradictory roles throughout his life. Long-lost friends would become close business partners. Lovers would become business partners. Business partners would become enemies. Lovers would become enemies. And enemies would become friends, and friends would become enemies again. Coming up on The Black and the Reckless.
I preach in the name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. You may ask, what organization is that? It is for me to inform you that the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that seeks to unite into one.
One of the several cast of characters playing a significant role in the early development of Marcus Garvey was Dusè Muhammad Ali. Ali was an Egyptian actor turned activist with a mysterious past and editor of the African Times and Orient Review. Before launching the publication, Dusè Muhammad was best known for his portrayals of Othello and the Prince of Morocco, as well as writing and producing theater company productions across the British Isles. However, questions surrounding the legitimacy of his Egyptian heritage were being floated around aristocratic circles. In response, Ali wrote "In the Land of Pharaohs" as a rebuttal to his haters. His book received international applause in the beginning, but soon it was revealed that he had plagiarized Arab scholars like Wilfrid Blunt without citation. Although these were major hits to his reputation, his overall credibility among Brits sidestepped accusations of fraud. And he soon called to his stage some of the most prominent so-called black writers in the world to be contributors at the Times and Orient Review. Young Marcus, through his persistence, managed to get a foot in the door at the publication. In the beginning, he wasn't a writer, but was hired on as a messenger and handyman. The mere presence of Dusè Muhammad Ali and Garvey's association with the world-renowned academic brought within itself an air of prominence Marcus dearly longed for. The journey across the Atlantic and his long dock days for little pay were starting to collect tangible dividends. While under the mentorship of Dusè Muhammad, Marcus maintained the unwritten role of apprentice, learning the publishing game from a certified professional. This would eventually solidify itself as one of the most laudable aspects of Garvey's talents. Ali, the Egyptian Sudanese national turned Brit, was a self-identified pan-Ethiopianist, a philosophy advocating for the end of British imperial rule in Egypt and Ethiopia. Though the proposed use of the African Times and Orient Review would basically criticize and even oppose British occupation, Dusè cleverly or deceptively solicited support from some of the top elites in London by publishing their private letters supporting his paper, thereby claiming these men were contributing writers during its launch. Finally, after consistent annoyance over the span of months, Garvey was given an opportunity to prove his value as a freelance contributor to Ali. Garvey's will to establish himself among the intellectual elite gave him the enthusiastic energy to face multiple pursuits during his days in the UK, from trying his hand at Speaker's Corner to fanatically following the debates of David Lloyd George, and even enlisting in night classes. The young Marcus put every iron at his disposal into the fire. Now established with employment, Marcus even sent for his sister Indiana by writing a letter to her employer, George Judah, requesting she be allowed to accompany his family on their trip to London. Investigate George Judah. Perhaps Garvey was most influenced during his tour of Europe, where he traveled from Scotland to Paris and from Monte Carlo to Madrid, with several stops in between. On this tour, he was most pleased at the reception he received from the white Europeans he met along his journey. They looked at him with befuddled interest, many taking him for African royalty. Quote from Negro with the Hat, The Rise and Fall of Marcus Garvey. Quote, on mainland Europe, Garvey ticketed off the great architectural wonders and soon fell in with some of the traveling missionaries. Not quite believing his good fortune, he was quietly pleased with the impression he seemed to make along the way. I have seen wonders, he wrote enthusiastically to McCormick. At some places, I have been the only black man seen for a good time. Some of the tourists are wondering how a black man can travel about so much. Some take me for an African millionaire. In subsequent letters, Garvey cited his popularity amongst his aristocratic lady fellow travelers and playfully speculated that he might one day return to Jamaica with a white heiress on his arm. 2 months later, it was apparent that it wasn't just Europe's great architectural sites that caught the young man's attention. On March 2nd, 1914, Marcus Garvey confided bashfully to Alfred Cap Burroughs, I am engaged to a Spanish-Irish heiress whom I had the pleasure of meeting on the continent. Providence had waved her magical hand and an heiress had materialized. He had mused on the fantasy of a union with such a creature. Remarkably, it now seemed a distinct possibility. It was a spectacular volte-face. Love had triumphed over his often stated and violently held belief that any union between blacks and whites was repugnant. It is somewhat destructive of my principle, he conceded, yet I hardly think I can change my mind marrying her. End quote. But alas, Garvey's hot boy summer in Europe was soon coming to an end. Back in London, after getting a taste of the freelance desk, Marcus's actual job as a handyman messenger became less of a priority, which led to him eventually being relieved of duty from the African Times and Orient Review. Ali complained Marcus was lazy. After this turn of events, his luck all but ran out. Marcus again asked for help from the Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society. It was finally time to return home. But again, without his sister, who had been stranded in London due to her own financial circumstances. But for his bit, Marcus had to work to pay his 3-week return voyage to Jamaica aboard the SS Trent. While on his passage across the Atlantic, Marcus meets a South African missionary who tells him of the horrors of black mistreatment in Basuto land. It was at this point, or so it is attested, that the young Marcus Garvey came to the vision of an African home state for the so-called African people. And so was born Garvey's Pan-African movement. Or was it? Haven't we done this before? All right. Wasn't that like the white thing back in America? I'm not sure if Garvey knew about that. All right, they tried that. Within a few weeks of his return home, Marcus was already in the works for the creation of the United Negro Improvement Association. His ability to compel new recruits to his cause was unparalleled and unmatched, and one of his new recruits was a 17-year-old Amy Ashwood, a young woman from a wealthy, elite Jamaican family. Upon meeting her at a local debate one night, Marcus follows her afterwards to the tram, laid down a bit of that aristocratic talk game, and the teenager was all but putty in his hands. After learning about Marcus and their age difference, Amy's mother was suspicious about the intentions of a grown man with her daughter. who at the time was holding UNIA meetings from his live-in hotel room. Garvey campaigned for his position like none other. He used the subsequent months following his repatriation to establish connections to the Jamaican political elite. Within the first year, Marcus had compiled a list of his supporters from the wealthiest and most affluent and mostly white movers and shakers on the island. With these newly established relationships and a fresh hymen full of teen spirit on his arm, Garvey's stock was rising. And although his stock was rising, drama was soon to follow. On this episode of The Black and the Reckless, the relationship between Marcus and Amy faces trouble as Amy's father, Mr. Westwood, does not approve of the courtship between his privileged daughter and the lowly Marcus. Ashwood and Garvey had a passionate love affair that aroused theatric performance of affection from Marcus. As Ashwood remembers, he most certainly had a flair for the dramatic. Quote, as Amy Ashwood was to recall, theirs was a partnership steeped in the movement. There was no separation between love and labor, so that a hand-holding, moonlit stroll down the bay was immediately followed by the more pressing business of planning the running order of speeches for the next UNIA meeting. Your Napoleon is longing to see you, longing to gaze into your beautiful eyes, Garvey wrote breathlessly, only to continue on a more sober note with, let no mother, no father, no sister, no brother stand in the way of the redemption of Africa. I will always worship at your shrine. Garvey's relationship with Amy Ashwood was intense and passionate and occasionally melodramatic. He loved in a great manner, wrote Ashwood, and was soon urging me to announce our engagement openly. I took the precaution of only wearing the ring when my mother was out of sight. Only weeks later, Ashwood decided that their relationship was too intense and problematic and decided to suspend their engagement. Returning home, I discovered a note from Marcus. He poured out such a torrent of feeling that my youthful sensibilities were almost overwhelmed. At the end of the letter, Garvey warned that he was going to commit suicide by throwing himself into the sea. Ashwood held a taxi and rushed to that section of the beach where Marcus was accustomed to promenade. There he was, and I almost collapsed with relief at finding him on time. The engagement was renewed. End quote. Yet, despite her father's disapproval, Marcus wasn't prepared to abandon his Aaliyah, and he would continue to rock the boat. Amy couldn't have been any younger, and Marcus wasn't getting any older. But perhaps, more importantly, neither one of them were getting any younger, so they might as well do it. In 1915, Marcus and Amy were secretly engaged, although Marcus had to tie up a lily-white loose end. Quote, the Spanish-Irish heiress needed to be notified that his affections were now directed elsewhere. In any case, his resolve to defy convention dribbled away. In her memoir, Amy Ashwood related that Garvey wrote to his fiancée soon after breaking off the engagement. Garvey's letter has not been found, and Amy Ashwood's account is almost certainly a paraphrase of the original, in which Garvey makes the sober observation, marriage between us is now impossible. You will be far happier with a member of your own race, so I will be with one of mine. According to Amy Ashwood, Garvey begged forgiveness from the heiress. He told her, I have seen a girl, blood of my blood and of my own race. End quote. As the UNIA grew in popularity, Marcus set out to form alliances with the social aristocracy, which predominantly consisted of prestigious white men with the occasional brown Jamaican elect mixed in. An imperative order of business propagated by the first years of the UNIA was their pledged allegiance to the British Empire and King George during the theater of World War I. In fact, Garvey even called for black Jamaican men to enlist in the military and fight with the Allied powers on the Western Front. Just 2 decades before, General Blackton, general of the Jamaican military, spoke at the UNIA, the British military used Jamaican forces in West Africa during the colonization of West Africa during the first 2 Ashanti Wars. In Garvey's mind, Jamaicans have already proven their loyalty to the empire in the greatest way possible by sacrificing their lives on the battlefield. And although this very same regiment was responsible for murdering Africans, perpetuating British rule in Africa, and Garvey himself was a self-proclaimed Pan-Africanist, he was manifestly devoted to the British cause. And in his enthusiasm in supporting the British cause, he may have very well stuck his foot in his mouth. General Blackton had expressed a level of aversion toward Jamaican recruits, advertising his contempt in a string of insults, describing them as a ragtag group of pitiful men, too intellectually incompetent to be of any good use in modern warfare. In his support of the general, Garvey stated in an address at Collegiate Hall, quote, "To the cultured mind, the bulk of our people are contemptible. To go into the country parts of Jamaica, you will see their villainy and vice of the worst kind, immorality, obeah, and all kinds of dirty things. Kingston and its envious are so infested with the uncouthly vulgar of our people that we of the cultured class feel positively ashamed to move about while this society has set itself to the task to go among the people and raise them to the standard of civilized people," end quote. These were the words that would come back to bite Garvey in his black ass. It wasn't just that Marcus had degraded the common Jamaican man in print, thus broadcasting national character defamation as the mouthpiece for a prominent white man he hoped to impress. But he essentially Euro-stepped his mulatto and quadroon-class Jamaican counterparts, who had traditionally comprised of the ancestry among the upper class since the days of Jewish Spaniard colonization on the island. Garvey essentially had alienated himself from potential political alliances. In his zeal to make waves, the hierarchical chain of command had been circumvented. Not only were the upper-class Jamaicans perturbed by his indifference to their positions, but middle and lower-class Jamaicans saw Garvey as a bourgeoisie wannabe, fully intent on riding the rhetoric of black degradation into prosperity. His grandiose allegiances toward the British Empire did nothing in the hopes to foster goodwill amidst his fellow compatriots. In their mind, Garvey had sold out to the establishment, and they took special exception with him using the same racist rhetoric often propagated by elite whites in their debasement of the darker races. As they saw it, he was an opportunist, and no friend to those who consider themselves native Jamaicans. And even worse, a con artist. Suggestions proliferated. Impropriety of the financial sense, of which the dollars weren't making. If the UNIA was the plug, then Garvey ran off on that bit more than twice, as he was accused of misappropriating funds to finance his hot boy pretentious lifestyle. Or maybe they were just jealous. In just 2 years since returning as an unknown third-class passenger on a boat from London, a broke, audacious Garvey had finessed himself into a potential player without the help of aristocratic bloodlines. And as much as they tried, Garvey's influence could not be denied. Just 2 years earlier, Marcus had been inspired by men like Booker T. Washington after reading his book Up from Slavery aboard an SS Trent. Now, Marcus likened himself to Bumbleclot, Washington, the Jamaican version. Only Marcus had not yet built a school. He specifically modeled certain attributes of the UNIA after the Tuskegee machine. Garvey shared merely a brief correspondence with the man who created Tuskegee, but that was enough to galvanize Marcus into his own plan to visit the Institute and shake hands with Booker T himself. To show his respect, the brief letters between Booker and Marcus were read aloud at UNIA meetings, with Marcus receiving an open-ended invitation to visit Tuskegee. But alas, Washington died in 1915, leaving a void in Garvey's anticipation of their first congregation. Booker T, the great Negro American and founder of Tuskegee, was dead, and Washington's adversary would soon become Garvey's. In Jamaica, speculation about Garvey and his lifestyle abounded. Discourse ran amok between the mulatto elite and the aspiring Black Moses. As Colin Grant puts it, Garvey had tried to blend with the brown elite and had been rejected, end quote. All of this culminated into Garvey's movement completely losing traction. The allegations of mismanagement of finances were printed on the pages of the Gleaner, the same paper that first published Garvey's Euro escapades. But now the embarrassment of failure drove Garvey's pursuit for a change of scenery. His fiancée, Amy Ashwood, swept away by her father to Panama in his demonstration of objection to their love. A heartbroken Marcus had lost his one in a million, and not even a 4-page letter was going to bring back his young island secret. At first, Garvey did not succeed in England or Jamaica, but he would soon dust himself off and try again in America.
Take me back, baby, you're all I'm craving for. Take me back, baby, please let me have once more. The keys on my key ring that opens your front door. Take me back, baby, I'm kinda plump, that's true.
The now 29-year-old Garvey lands in New York City, the preeminent hub for West Indian migrants, and immediately set his sights uptown. There was only one place that would have been considered the Mecca of Black culture at the time. The legend had long preceded the Renaissance and the booming indigenous American and West Indian population turned Harlem into the unofficial capital of Black America. As the popular narrative goes, after the construction of the Panama Canal, a wave of West Indian migration took place from a large contingent of that group seeking employment opportunities in the Apple, compounded by direct immigration from Jamaica, Trinidad, and the Lesser Antilles. The demographic underwent a transition during the early 1900s after a wave of race riots that saw many previous Jewish, Italian, first and second generation migrants move out of Harlem and replaced, which also saw a swell of migrants from the South looking to socially distance from Jim and his crows. Quote, Harlem exerted a romantic and magical hold on the imagination of Black people in the Americas. Marcus Garvey's and the UNIA's favorite poet, Paul Dunbar captured that sense of wonder in the sport of the gods when he wrote of black people who had heard of New York as a vague place and a faraway city that, like heaven to them, had existed only by faith alone. The first tentative steps to Harlem were taken by black residents already living in Lower Manhattan. They weren't just moving because they aspired to better living conditions. In 1900, fear was also the spur. On August 15th that year, racial tensions exploded and rioting broke out in the rough Hell's Kitchen following the death of a policeman killed in a tussle with an African American whose wife, the patrolman, was trying to arrest for soliciting, having mistaken her for a prostitute. Vengeful policemen reached an understanding with an angry white mob that descended on the district, beating and bludgeoning any black man who was unfortunate enough to be on the streets. A similar riot a few years later in 1905 convinced unsettled and unprotected blacks to pack up and move out to the safe, if expensive, haven of Harlem. End quote.
You must take the A train to go to Sugar Hill way up in Harlem. If you miss the A train, you'll find you missed the quickest way to Harlem. Hurry, get on now, it's coming. Listen to those rails are thrumming. All aboard, get on the A train. Soon you will be on Sugar Hill in Harlem. You take your baby to Harlem, you're bound to find the hall up on Sugar Hill, where everyone's having a solid ball. You board that A train, and then you ride till you dig this number, 145th Street, where all the cats meet, posing on the stroll. Pops are really in there.
Families doubled up or took in lodgers to meet their rent on the solid, overpriced brownstones. Garvey was doing his Jamaican landlord a favor in occupying a little hall bedroom, hardly heated or well ventilated, remembered Edgar Gray, an early acquaintance. Decades later, Garvey was still quoting from his vivid recollection of a poorly clad asthmatic Negro whom he saw in Rose's diary room day after day, eating portions of corned beef hash at the small cost of 15 cents. I visited his lodgings and saw there dozens of empty sardine tins, beans, and cooked or prepared soup cans from which he had eaten morsels so rude and meager as to draw forth the pity of any who saw him. Garvey's rationing was an absolute necessity, as early on his asthma limited his ability to work. Even with this self-sacrifice and careful budgeting, he could barely meet the cost of his rent, much to his landlord's dismay. It was often said at the time the black man in Harlem was like a poor relation who'd inherited a limousine he could ill afford to maintain. End quote. Throughout Garvey's time in America, specifically in New York, he was met with an ensemble cast of players. If anything, Garvey's blind, if not delusional, conviction for his purpose was a sentiment not lost among his closest friends, or even his vicious rivals. Marcus was already compiling plans for the reemergence of the UNIA on the streets of Harlem. But the struggle of gaining a captive audience would prove quite difficult for the Jamaican Joshua. Nonetheless, his meager lifestyle did nothing to thwart his confidence, as he spent days and nights constructing a constitution for the new improved UNIA 2.0. If Garvey had any hopes of making a name for himself, he would need to be vetted by somebody of significant influence. One major player in the ascension of Garvey was a man by the name of Bruce Gritt. John Edward Bruce could best be described as the Nino Brown of Harlem intellectuals. Born in Maryland As a child, he and his mother moved further north after the days of the Civil War. At some point, Bruce acquired a 3-month education from Howard. Later, Bruce was hired first as a runner for the New York Times, and then as an editor, corresponding with certain politicians who were perceived as champions of so-called African American rights. Bruce Gritt, a noted Pan-Africanist and a nationally paid propagandist of the Republican Party, became one of the leading voices behind the philosophy of the Harlem Renaissance. Bruce wasn't just prominent in elite black circles, he had cracked the ceiling. His connections among prominent politicians set the course for his writings to appear in several papers even before the year 1900. He joined the Afro-American League in 1890. What is the Afro-American League, you ask? The Afro-American League is actually the predecessor to the NAACP, but with far less success. The League again tried to revive itself 8 years later, changing its name into the National Afro-American League. Founded by quite possibly the blackest man in the movement, Timmy Tom Fortune, the council eventually disbanded due to infighting among its list of members, which included Boulè opponents Booker T. Washington and W.E.B Dubois. But Timmy Tom, like Bruce Gritt, was a popular journalist and Pan-Africanist whose clout wasn't completely hitched to the dying League. Fortune was also a publisher of a successful black newspaper called The New York Age and enjoyed personal relationships with the same prominent Republicans as did John E. Bruce, the man up in Harlem. Even before screening Garvey on American soil, Bruce had been working as a contributor for the African Times and Orient Review, the same publication previously occupied by Marcus and run by Dusè Muhammad Ali. In 1911, Gritt partnered with Dutch Caribbean immigrant Arturo Schomburg to create the Negro Society for Historical Research. Schomburg was born in Puerto Rico to German Jewish immigrants directly connected to the slave trade. The Schomburg family, which is the same lineage as the Bergman family out of Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands, can trace its history all the way back to Frederick Hermann Schomburg, Duke of Schomburg. The name Bergman is simply a transmutated variation of the same name, Hermann Schomburg, dropping the first 2 syllables and inversing the remainder. Many of these Spanish, Dutch, German, Jewish immigrant families have changed their family surnames into numerous literary forms, possibly to conceal their true identities. Schomburg is also considered one of the intellectual leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, to the degree that New York Public Library named a special divisional collection in his honor under the financing and philanthropy of the Carnegie Foundation and the Julius Rosenwald Foundation. The division was named the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Within the crux of this narrative, Ernestine Rose played the role of the crossover culture librarian. She purchased much of Schomburg's work in her attempts to create programs for African Americans. This Ernestine Rose should not be confused with Ernestine Pulaski Rose, who was lovingly referred to as the first Jewish feminist. This original Ernestine Rose, born Rose Pulowska, was born into a noble Polish aristocratic family who can trace his ancestry back to the ruling families of Poland and Ukraine, including Boleslaw the Curly and the Potocki dynasty. Ironically, Ernestine Rose 2.0, the feminist librarian and sympathizer of the Black plight, was also well entrenched in Jewish, socialist, and communist circles. But Original Recipe is widely considered a pioneer of women's suffrage, whose contemporaries include Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, and Susan B. Anthony, a regular Mount Blushmore of women's rights. Ironically, Rose was an avowed atheist, yet her father was a prominent rabbi. According to Charles Summerby, she was labeled by a newspaper a female atheist 1,000 times lower than a prostitute. Despite her unpopularity, she still found favor amidst her religious counterparts as a champion for women's rights, as did Diet Rose 2.0, who had been essential in acquiring the collection of Arturo Schomburg, who had a career relationship with John E. Bruce. Both men founding the Negro Society for Historical Research. This endeavor highlighted and specialized in the cooperation between American, African, and West Indian scholars. One of these West Indian so-called scholars was Hubert Harrison. Born in St. Croix, Harrison became a protege of Arturo Schomburg, and to a lesser degree, John Bruce. Harrison was also an atheist and held court with some of the top Darwinists of the time. Harrison often contended with top Christian ministers, with some of his lectures breaking out into riots between Christians and his supporters. Hubert also congregated in circles of the white and beige elite, chopping it up with people like Rothschild Francis, Bill Hayward, and Patrick Quinlan, who was a leading member of the Socialist Party, as was Harrison. At some point during Garvey's first American lecture tour, or soon thereafter, Garvey met Hubert Harrison. In several ways, their lives are linked together. Their strongest link was John Edward Bruce and Arturo Schomburg, who of course were both Prince Hall Freemasons. Bruce Gritt wrote the book Prince Hall, the founder of Negro Masonry, proofs of the legitimacy of Prince Hall Freemasonry. Indeed, Bruce was substantial in the involvement of Prince Hall Freemasonry and their petition for recognition within the greater Freemasonic body. Quote, when Garvey sat down to compose the constitution of the brave new UNIA, he drew heavily on the charters of other fraternal benevolent organizations like the Black Freemasons. A life insurance policy formed one of the central planks of the UNIA Book of Laws, providing death benefits to members. This was in line with other fraternities and was particularly attractive to Black people who were frequently denied such coverage by insurance companies. The UNIA's promise of a lump sum of $75 toward every member's funeral moved the specter of the pauper's grave that overshadowed their lives. Peace and death then, but the ascent of the organization was most definitely on prosperity and life. Mutual improvement associations were nothing new. Garvey's innovation was an attempt to wield commercial and cultural aspirations onto the body of the soon-to-be improved Negro. The source of the numerous titles enshrined in the UNIA handbook, including High Chancellor, Chaplain General, Potnet, and Supreme Commissioner, could also be traced back to African Freemasonry. Garvey borrowed some of the nomenclature along with aspects of its philosophy. The anachronistic sounding Potnet was an abbreviation of the Imperial Potnet of the ancient Egyptian order of the nobles of the mystic shrine, Black Shriners, made famous by the peerless Black Mason, Prince Hall. In a prevailing climate of political impotence and disenfranchisement, only the Masons and parallel fraternities provided opportunities for Black collective organization outside the church. The cautious and clever Prince Hall was just the kind of figure whom Bruce believed should serve as a model of shrewd leadership. End quote. Wilfred Domingo, a childhood homeboy of Marcus from St. Ann's Bay, had once served as UNIA secretary back in Jamaica. He was now in Harlem, reunited with his compadre, each looking for a slice. Domingo was the first editor of the UNIA publication, The Negro World. But he and Marcus would eventually fall out due to his overtly socialist editorials, which brought unwanted attention from the anti-communist sentiment of the time. In addition to Wilfred Domingo, Bruce Gritt and Hubert Harrison were both regular contributors to the UNIA's publication, Negro World. Again on American soil, Garvey proclaims his allegiance to the Allied forces during World War I in 1917, even going so far as enlisting himself to serve within the armed forces. But he was proclaimed physically unfit, mostly due to his chronic bout with asthma. Later, he changed his stance, calling the conflict a white man's war. As his popularity rose, the Bureau of Investigation took a heightened interest in his rhetoric, labeling him as politically subversive. But after an investigation, Garvey was cleared of any incendiary accusations. It is a matter of fact. Marcus Garvey was confirmed, vetted, and deep-rooted in professional and personal relationships with some of the highest-ranking Prince Hall Freemasons in America. After arriving in Harlem, the UNIA was remodeled following the structure, statutes, and even some of the titles used in Freemasonry. As well, officers within the UNIA were indeed Freemasons. John Bruce and Arturo Schomburg, two of the most well-established men in Harlem, operated within circles that superseded their loyalties to Marcus or the UNIA. No matter how close their friendships became, Schomburg and Bruce were Masons first. Yet, this still doesn't answer the direct question: was Marcus Garvey a Freemason? Here's what we know. In 1922, the UNIA was described by Hodge Kiernan as a fraternal order from its very inception. Harry Albro Williamson, a top Freemason historian from the Grand Lodge of New York, wrote several publications related to Freemasonry, including The Origin of Freemasonry Among Negroes in America, Negroes and Freemasonry, The Negro in Masonic Literature, The Prince Hall Primer, A Chronological History of Prince Hall Freemasonry, The Order of the Eastern Star, and the UNIA publication, The Negro World, promoting the Masonic Brotherhood in June 1922. One of his lovers, not yet mentioned, said Garvey became a Mason through the influence of John E. Bruce, but due to his schedule, wasn't able to attend lodge meetings. She also shared that UNIA members and officers were saturated well within the ranks of Black Greek organizations. Other commentaries from observers made note of the regalia worn by UNIA officers. They wore a military-shaped helmet with a large flowing white feather, closely resembling the uniform hat worn by Masons on special parade occasions, end quote. So if Marcus Garvey wasn't a Mason, it should be a surprise. He congregated with Masons, was mentored by Masons, hired Masons to promote Masonry, created an organization based off the principles of Freemasonry, and dressed like a Tampa Bay Buccaneer. Perhaps Marcus wasn't a Mason, and he just took his fanhood to the next level. Nonetheless, the connection cannot be denied in the least. When John E. Bruce, quite possibly the father of the Harlem Renaissance, died, his Masonic funeral was held at UNIA headquarters, and he was eulogized by Garvey. Here is a picture of Garvey standing with Arturo Schomburg, surrounded by Freemasons, at the burial place of John E. Bruce. Take of it what you must, but these Prince Hall Freemasons weren't the only Masons Garvey was in confederacy with.
Garvey's father was a Mason, a professional Mason. And among the things that he did was to create tombs for people in the St. Anne's Bay graveyard. He took Garvey with him to the graveyard one day, and they were digging this grave, and his father had Garvey go down inside the grave, but then he pulled the ladder up and left the child in the bottom of the grave. Garvey said that he cried out and his father wouldn't let him get back up out of the grave. He wanted to teach him a lesson.
Alone in the grave, young Marcus Garvey learned that he could rely on no one but himself. It was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life.
W.E.B might be screaming for immunity. Fell apart, co-and-tell disrupted communities. Crack dealers had immunity until they didn't. Now the judge sentenced them niggas with impunity. But who are we? Afraid of Malcolm, afraid of Martin, afraid of Moses. I beg your pardon. On behalf of your people, I apologize. But that is what it is to be colonized. Afraid of Malcolm, afraid of Martin, afraid of Moses. I beg your pardon. On behalf of your people, I apologize. But that is what it is to be colonized. Run it, run it, run it. Shut your mind. Run it, run it, run it. Stress it. Run from my problems, run from my blessings. Cause we don't want none, we run from the lessons. Run it, and guess it. Run it, run it, run it. Stress it. Run from my problems, run from my blessings. Cause we don't want none, we run from the lessons. Afraid of Malcolm, afraid of Martin, afraid of Moses. I beg your pardon. On behalf of your people, I apologize. But that is what it is to be colonized. Afraid of Malcolm, afraid of Martin, afraid of Moses. I beg your pardon. On behalf of your people, I apologize. But that is what it is to be colonized. Run it, tell your mind. Run it, chest it. Run it, run it, run it, stress it. Run from my problems, run from my blessings. Cause we don't want none, we run from the messes. My people, my people, my people. Not considered people, my people, people, not considered my people, people, they're not considered they're my people, still not considered people, not considered my people, not considered people, still not considered people, my people, people not considered equal. A meteor has more right than my people.
And y'all gonna stop doing this. This is racism, okay? You see Susan B. Anthony got hair. The Jewish Betty Boop got hair. And the other bitch got hair. But Sojourner Truth, like, where's her do-rag? Where's her do-rag? See, that's how they be doing black women. With no do-rag. Like, where's her do-rag? Shit. More like Sojourner lie. I need the architect masons of Mount Blushmore to
throw some rocks on Sojourner's head to complete the do-rag. Respectfully. This nigga looked like a scout team fullback for the Montego Bay Buccaneers. You know he's gonna put that sword in his mouth. Look like he about to go colonize Mexico with this outfit on right here. I mean, he only took night classes at Birkbeck College, but nigga's looking like a graduate right here.
On the next episode of The Black and the Reckless, Marcus is united with his long-lost love, Amy Ashwood, but their passionate love affair was about to get turned upside down into a tawdry love triangle, complete with all the baby mama drama you niggas are used to. On the next episode of The Young and the Reckless. The Boulè. On the next episode of The Boulè.